Okay, let's see, what time is it? All right, it's 2:40. And this time I don't think I have a, I guess we go through regular routine, right? Open the meeting and all. Okay. All right, this time I'll entertain a motion to accept the agenda for this workshop. Is there a motion? Mr. Glavin, thank you, Mr. Glavin. A second by Mr. Gines. All right, thank you. Any discussion? All in favor? Okay. You may want to make a note that Mr. Lawrence and Mr. Barron are out of the room. Here's Mr. Lawrence, right on time. All right, that brings us to the presentation agenda, the mayor's report. Good, there is none. The no departmental reports, any council reports. We'll start with Mr. Glavin.
I have no report.
I have no report. Mr. Deming, Mr. Lawrence, Ms. Newman of Ward 3. Mr. Gines, okay, we're good to go then. At this point, if the clerk would read the purpose for today's meeting. Thank you.
Purpose of the meeting is to discuss ordinance amending portion chapter 8 of the flood damage and prevention ordinance pertaining to floodplain management and to discuss Fema and the National Flood Insurance Program updates.
Thank you, Carrie. Mr. Creel, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here today and bringing your staff. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the council. Last week, the department asked the city council to consider revising the current flood ordinance to add 1 foot of freeboard to the existing 1 foot above base flood elevation that the ordinance requires already. This change, if approved, would require that any new structure, addition, or substantial improvement to be located in the flood zone would be elevated 2 feet above base flood elevation instead of the 1 that's required now. Now, the reason for this request is to ensure that with the changes that are coming to the National Flood Insurance Program that will become effective October the 1st, that we maintain the 25% discount that homeowners are currently receiving on their flood insurance policies. In the back of the room, I've got Rick Stickler, who is our floodplain manager, and I have Kristen Greger, who is our CRS coordinator. And if you'll bear with me until the end of the presentation, I'm going to bring them up. They've actually participated in the training sessions that went on with MEMA covering this information. But the program that we're talking about that goes into effect is going to be called RISC 2.0. And I think it's important before I talk about the changes for me to just kind of bring you up to speed on the way that these programs work right now. And I'll try not to bore you with it, but I think it's important for you to know how we're operating now with regard to these programs so that when I get to the section about the changes, you'll see what a difference it's going to make. And then we'll be happy at the end to answer any questions that you have. The 3 to 4 agencies that we deal with the most when it comes to flood are the National Flood Insurance Program, the Community Rating System, and of course FEMA, and then MEMA, the subcategory. And then we're going to talk about the Flood Damage Prevention Ordinance, which is what we're asking you to amend. Under the National Flood Insurance Program, remember that they're the federal agency that provides flood insurance for homeowners, and their organization, their agency, is driven by the insurance industry. And their primary purpose is to look for ways to reduce damage and to reduce loss in the event that we have an event, in the event that we have a flood or a storm that comes through. The National Flood Insurance Program subsidizes part of the premium for property owners. Now, the standard policy for a flood policy is $2,000 a year. But because of our participation in CRS and the discounts we're able to get, then most people will pay somewhere between $400 and $700. And I'm going to go over that a little bit more in just a minute. But this program has continually lost money since its creation in 1968. I've put in your packet there the amount of money that has been lost and how they're currently $20 billion in debt. So they are currently seeking ways to cut losses. This is what they do. And since Hurricane Katrina, many of the people who have rebuilt have actually built in compliance with the ordinance. So the discounts are increasing. These people are getting increasing discounts, which means that less money is going back into the National Flood Insurance Program. That's the NFIP. Currently under the CRS program, and let me just remind you that the CRS program is actually a voluntary program. We're not required to participate in it. We choose to participate in it. And we, as part of our participation, we agree to perform certain activities that are designed to reduce risk of damage during an event. Now, the city is required to adopt the FEMA model ordinance. FEMA puts together a model ordinance that they have that is considered a minimum requirement. It's kind of like the building code, where we are required to adopt that model ordinance. And as part of participation in CRS, there is only one requirement, only one activity that's required, and that is that we require and maintain elevation certificates. Anything over and above that is something that we take on because we're trying to achieve points to increase those discounts for homeowners. A city or county is given a 1 to 10 rating based on the total number of points that we earn from taking on these activities. Now, we can choose to take on additional activities, and the manual is about this thick, full of activities that we can voluntarily take on to try and increase those discounts for people. And I have a list of those activities. If you would like, I'll be happy to provide you with a copy. So that's NFIP and CRS. So now we get to the flood damage prevention ordinance. Again, we're required to adopt the basic model ordinance. The ordinance is considered minimal standards. The city can amend the ordinance to enhance the requirements for additional points and possibly improve our CRS rating. The FEMA model ordinance right now requires that structures that are built in the flood zone are built at the base flood elevation, not above it. Our ordinance currently requires a 1-foot freeboard, and because we've adopted that 1-foot freeboard, we get an additional 100 points in our CRS point total, and that's going to be important. I'm going to get to that in just a minute. Currently, the program that we're using under the flood zones, we use digital maps that are provided by Fema, and they actually show a lot of information. They show where the boundaries for the special flood hazard area are, and properties are either in the special flood hazard area or they're outside the special flood hazard area. The current flood zones that we deal with are the AE zone, and that's the zone where you're basically just dealing with rising and falling water. There's no current behind it, but we also have two other zones, the coastal A zone and the velocity zone, and those are the zones where when you have rising water, you have current that's pushing it. We often refer to the coastal A zone as the junior velocity zone because the wave action is not as testy. According to the maps now in the ordinance, a property is either in the flood zone or it's outside the flood zone. And with regard to structures, those structures are either in compliance with the flood regulations. Now, many of the existing buildings that we have in the city are grandfathered in, and what that means is that they were built in compliance with the flood ordinance and the elevations that were in place at the time that they were built. So if the ordinance changes, these structures are grandfathered in under their previous ordinance, and therefore they're getting what's called an artificially low rate, or the preferred rate. Under the CRS rating scale, again, you're either rated at a 1 through a 10, 1 being the best, 10 being the worst, or the entry level. The total points earned determines our rating. Each rating, each grade that we improve below a 10 provides property owners that have a flood insurance policy with an additional 5%. So every time we come down a grade, that's another 5% discount they get. And because we're a 5 right now, that's why the people that are inside the flood zone who have a policy are getting a 25% discount. Now, people who are outside the flood zone who have a policy are currently getting a 10% discount. So we not only work hard to maintain our existing rating, our 5 rating, which again is the best in the state, but we're also continuing to look for other activities that'll improve our rating even more. Because CRS involves other departments, it's not just a community development function, but because we have to rely on engineering and public works to provide us with other data like ditch cleaning documents and those kind of things, then we can only take on certain activities that we have the staff to accomplish. On our current maps, the digital maps show the base flood elevation. It also shows the topo, so we can usually give people basic information and let them know, what the BFE is for their property. But because their topo is so high, we can usually tell them about how high they're going to have to build above the ground. But that's still not a substitute for an elevation certificate. Any new structures have to be built at least 1 foot above the BFE. The elevation above ground level is determined by the topo level. Now, in the A zone, in the A flood zone that we mentioned, it involves around the finished floor of the structure that's being built. Your finished floor has to be built to 1 foot above BFE. But in the coastal A or the velocity zone, you go to the bottom of the lowest horizontal member, or to the bottom of the floor joist. Because of that wave action through there, you don't want it hitting any obstruction. Elevation certificates, again, this is the only activity that's required by CRS, and it's required by the National Flood Insurance Program, CRS, and our city ordinance. They have to be developed by or filled out by a professional engineer or a land surveyor. And the regs require that we must, in our department, we have to require and maintain elevation certificates as a database for future reference. And the thinking is behind that is that as we require these elevation certificates and we put them into our database, that if that property sells down the road and the new property owner comes in and wants to know, we've already got that information. We don't have to require them to go out and get another elevation certificate and pay those costs. That's the way that the programs work now. So now we're getting into risk 2.0, and that's I'm going to go over the changes that are coming about that will go into effect October the 1st. As I told you at the last meeting, what's happening is the National Flood Insurance Program, because it's basically hemorrhaging revenues coming in or premiums coming in, they're looking for ways to tighten the screws on each of these activities that we perform. And what that means is that whenever you have a certain activity that you're performing, let's say ditch cleaning, for example, there's a minimum number of points that you can get, and there's a maximum number of points. Well, in order to get the maximum number of points out of that activity, you have to dot every I and cross every T and make sure that you're doing everything that the section of the CRS manual requires. So what's happening is that as we're trying to maintain our CRS rating, we're being told by the CRS ISO, the CRS representatives, that, well, we're not given that same amount of points for that activity. You're only getting X number of points for that. So what that's doing is making it much more difficult for us to maintain the point totals that we have already. That's one of the changes that's going on right now, and we've actually been dealing with that for the past couple of years. With the new changes that are coming about, the grandfather status is going to be eliminated. There will be no grandfather status anymore. So those people that were getting the artificial or the preferred rate will now be subject to the standard amount, which is $2,000 a year. Also, they're doing away with the preferred rate. You know, if you under the previous ordinance and under our ordinance now, if you built in compliance with what was in place at the time, then you were eligible for what we call the preferred rate. And that's not going to happen anymore, because once some of these elevations change, then you won't be subject to the preferred rate. You'll be subject to the full rate as well. Under the Risk 2.0 program, although we will be required to use maps in the department, maps are not going to be used to determine the risk involved in individual properties. It won't be about zones anymore. It'll be about each individual property. And what they're going to do is to use satellite imagery to look or to identify and to determine the risk on that individual piece of property based on a number of criteria. The targeted risk is going to reflect the actual risk that's going to change the premium. And what we mean by that is that your risk is going to be determined on your particular structure. Is that structure on a slab foundation, or is it on an elevated foundation? That's going to be one of the things considered. The risk is also going to be determined by how close your structure and your property are to a water body and what the ground elevation is on that piece of property. They anticipate that substantial increases in premiums are going to begin October the 1st of this year. Some of the other changes involve that policies could see up to an 18% increase annually until the amount that they are paying equals the risk of the flooding for their insured structures. And the reason that 18% is in there is because the federal mandate limits the increase to 18% per year. So it could be that they pay 18% this year and they may be subject to 18% next year, or whatever they determine the risk assessment is. Existing structures will be evaluated. This is another change. Existing structures are going to be evaluated by the actual replacement cost, the age, the materials, and the labor that it would take to repair or replace that structure in the event that it's damaged. The program anticipates that there's going to be increased premiums across the board. They're projecting that 89% of the property owners in the city that have a flood insurance policy are going to see an increase. That's in Harrison County. For Hancock County and Jackson County, it's actually higher than that. It's going to be 94%. Structures that are on slabs are going to see the highest increases. Elevated structures may fare better. Now, one of the things to be considered here is that there are some mortgages out there on houses where the flood insurance premiums are escrowed into their mortgage payments. So as a result of these increases, their mortgage payments may go up, which could cause a real problem in the housing market. So why should we change our flood ordinance? Well, in order for us to get points through the CRS program and try to get a better rating, or even try to maintain the rating that we have, the requirements in our ordinance need to exceed the standard. You know, I mentioned before that the Fema model ordinance is just the standard. It's the minimum requirements. So whenever we adopt something in our ordinance that increases the standard or brings us above the norm, then we get points for that toward our total. The other reason is because in the new International Building Code that we're adopting, they already are changing it to require a 1-foot freeboard above the base flood elevation. So what we had in our ordinance, where we had a 1-foot freeboard, is now being required through the building code. So now that 1 foot above freeboard becomes the standard rather than the exception. So it's important for us to add another foot of freeboard so that we'll maintain those 100 points. We're doing what we can by recommending this 1 foot change so that we can maintain the 25% discount that homeowners are currently getting in the special flood hazard area. Now, one good thing about the changes is that there won't be a 10% discount for those people living outside the flood zone, because the people who live outside the flood zone who are getting the 10% discount, because the maps are not going to be used to determine this information, then not only the people inside the flood zone, but the people that are outside the flood zone will begin getting 25%. So that's going to be helpful to those people. So there is a good point to these changes. An extra 1 foot provides 100 points to serve as a cushion, but it must be in our ordinance. The 1 foot requirement must be in our ordinance in order for us to obtain the points. This extra 1 foot is needed to maintain our rating and our existing discounts. And we had a call yesterday, Rick Stickler, the floodplain manager, had a call yesterday where a lady was anticipating that her insurance was going to be $700, and when she talked to her insurance agent, they told her that no, it's going to be $2,000. And if you have questions about that, Rick can answer those when he comes up to answer his other questions. So who's going to be affected by changing this ordinance to increase the freeboard by another foot? This will only affect new construction, new additions, and what's considered substantial improvements. And a substantial improvement means that anyone who takes an existing structure that's in the flood zone that is out of compliance right now, and they're going to improve that structure to more than 50% of the fair market value, that's considered a substantial improvement. And any substantial improvements are required to elevate the structure as a part of those improvements to the building. Right now, we have documentation to show that since 2017, a number of people who found out that they could get increased discounts by going above what we already require in our ordinance have chosen to do that. You can see on the chart that I've provided in the packet that in 2017, 53% of the people on their own chose to go more than a foot above the base flood elevation, and last year, it was 90% of the people. So the question would be, well, if some people are already choosing to go above that, then why don't we just let it be their decision? Well, again, unless we put the requirement in our ordinance, we get no points for it. We currently have a total of 2,502 points, which gets us just over the requirement to get that 25% discount. And because the program is tightening the screws on these things, and we're looking at maybe getting less points on it, it would only take one deduction off of there to kick us from a 5 to a 4, which means that people who are getting 25% now would only be getting 20% after that, and that would be inside the flood zone and outside the flood zone. So it's very important for us to adopt this extra foot of freeboard so that we maintain that 100 points as a cushion, so that if we do lose a couple of points in another area, we still maintain that 5 rating. So that's pretty much it. Let me just say that Rick and Kristen went through the training. 2 years ago, they went to a training session at the Emergency Management Agency in the county, and they were told that this program was coming forward, but they were not given a lot of detail about it. And then 2 or 3 weeks ago, they went to a training session where they were told that it was coming, but they still were not given a lot of information about it. We don't know all the details about it. What I've given you is what we've been able to dig up, from the newspaper article and from some of the training that they've been to. But with that, I'll ask them to come up and we'll try to answer any questions you might have about this. The only request that we're making to the council to this ordinance is that we add that extra foot of freeboard. That's all. There are no other changes in the proposal. So,
Well, Kristen and Rick are coming up for questions if there are any. Cecilia, I just wanted to check for the PowerPoint presentation. You were able to capture that in the video, so that's included in the video. Thank you. Okay. Questions, Mr. Glavin?
Yeah, I have a couple. You mentioned substantial improvements. What was that percent? You mentioned 50%?
50% above the fair market value.
All right, what about significant repairs? Does that equal improvements, or if somebody loses their roof and and they replace their roof or something like that, does that start to come into that category?
It's 50% across the board, doesn't matter what you're doing.
Whether it's damaged or whether it's new additions, it does not matter. Okay. The other comment I have, months ago, we talked to a gentleman that discussed the concept of conservation easements and how that could get us points back. Are we pursuing any of those or in a systematic way that may also give us points back?
You know who he's talking about? That gentleman was actually more talking about us taking land and designated it as a AR. That was one of the main things that he was suggesting. Yeah, you remember that meeting that we had? Yes. It didn't really help us when it comes to these elevation requirements because I think what he was doing was proposing some things that we could use to get more CRS points.
Right.
But it wouldn't have anything to do with the elevation requirements because that's the minimum standard.
But it would help our flood rating if we pursued those conservation easements.
It could help it, yes,
Okay. All right, that's all I have for right now.
Any other questions or? Mr. Creel, just on, you mentioned it was an acronym, I guess, SFHA, and I missed what that meant. What is it?
Special flood hazard area. And that's just considered the flood zone. That's the way the maps refer to the flood zone.
Okay. Flood, okay. And I'm thinking usually when things like this come up, if somebody disagrees, why am I in the zone? I'm not supposed to be in the zone. There's an appeal process or whatever. So if I disagree as a homeowner, and then I got this huge bill, and I got to see somebody because this is not right. And who do I appeal to? Is that done locally or federally or regionally?
Well, one thing is that if a person disagrees with the satellite imagery that's going on, then they have the right to go get an elevation certificate to show, because the elevation certificate removes any doubt about whether it's in the flood zone, out of the flood zone, in compliance or out of compliance. That would be the only thing that would trump the satellite imagery. But let's just say that they still believe that they're not in the flood zone, then they can file an application for a letter of map revision or amendment that could actually, they have to hire an engineer to put this information together.
Right.
They submit it to Region 4 headquarters in Atlanta, and if the engineers at Region 4 agree with it, then they will notify us that it's being changed, the maps are being changed.
All right, the other thing I noticed, because basically you're not dealing with zones so much as you are individual characteristics associated with that property. And one of those was, I guess, for example, proximities to bodies of water. And I'm thinking, what if you've got a nice little creek, or as they say up north, you got a creek by your house, that sucker may fill up, and that may be the source of the water that now is in your home where you've lived for 20 years, and your base flood elevation is 8 feet or whatever. Mm-hmm. Or what if it's a drainage swale or a drainage ditch, or if it's a road within the city limits that for some reason maybe the drainage is not adequate, so in a heavy rain the water rises. Does that even come into play? I'm thinking based on what you said with the base flood elevation and the height, but I just want those folks that may be viewing this video to know that, if your house floods now because of, it may not be something you've done so much as it is the city's infrastructure, the design of a drainage system. How does that come into play, and what recourse might those homeowners have?
You want to take that one?
Under the new program, there's no way to know because they didn't really speak on that, but currently, city infrastructure is accounted for. If you have a drainage system, you'll get a favorable rating. If you don't, you won't.
Right, but I'm thinking the impact on the homeowner before, I guess what I'm asking is, maybe I'm not currently having to worry about flood insurance, but because this is, the program is changing, should I begin to worry about my home and the I mean, I can't do anything necessarily about the elevation, but do I need to, am I gonna get a letter saying, you need to get national flood you need to get flood insurance because you're in this area now? Does that, I don't know if my question makes sense.
But with our limited knowledge, I would say that yes, that's a very good possibility that you're going to get it. Because if you have a flood insurance policy, and let's say that you live next to a ditch, then you could become what's called a repetitive loss property, where you filed more than one claim on that property. So I would think that yes, that it's possible, even if you're living next to a drainage ditch and that ditch has a history of flooding, that you may be subject to increased premiums.
Wow, okay. Other questions? Mr. Lawrence?
Yeah, the 25%, how high can it go? Can you get 30%, 35%?
If we can get to a 1, if we can ever get to a 1, which will take a lot of effort on the part of the entire city, then 50% of the premiums can be subsidized by the National Flood Insurance Program.
You have to get to a 1.
Yes, sir. And it takes a total city commitment, because what happens is you have to have public works on board, you have to have engineering on board to help us provide a lot of these activities. And if we can do that, we can get to a 1. I mean, theoretically, we could get to a 1. And that would mean that people are only paying half of what they would normally pay for their flood insurance premiums.
Yeah, but how much it costs a person to do that? A ton of money. That's the problem. You have to put a lot of money out to save these points. Sometimes not worth it when you look at it that way.
That's right, and that's what we do when we're looking at activities. Is the reward worth the investment? If we have to go out and buy a bunch of new equipment in order to get 50 more points, certainly that wouldn't be worth it.
And now you're talking about flooding. What do you consider a surge in the hurricanes? Is that flooding? The surge?
The surge, yes, sir. That's considered flooding. Yes.
Because that's supposed to be rain events that creates flooding, not hurricanes. So I don't know what they actually worded that when a surge comes in.
Yes, sir. That's the way the program, and that's the way that FEMA and MEMA would look at it, is that even if it's a surge and it floods the house, then it's considered flooding.
And the people that building, you can see on the Highway 99, they building up 7-8 feet where they can be underneath the house. What is the rules for somebody where they underneath the house? What can they put downstairs?
If you want to take that? It's in the V zone, the house he's talking about down there by.
Well, the only thing you can put below an elevated structure is building access, parking, or storage.
And the storage is limited.
And the storage is limited to 299 square feet of.
Now, what do you consider so? I mean, like somebody who wants to put a refrigerator down there, an ice machine, can they do that? Or that has to be elevated a foot above the floor?
Evaluated case by case. If it's something that's easily movable, it's permitted. If what you refer to a refrigerator, somebody else may not. He may be talking about a walk-in. So therefore, it's evaluated case by case. If it's easily movable, then it would be approved.
So it'd be all right to do that.
It would be approved.
You know, a lot of people doing it. They're building nice homes down there on the beach. You can see that, and they're all doing it like 7-8 feet above, so they can utilize the space underneath it for whatever, parking cars in there, barbecue, whatever they want to do.
Yeah.
This National Flood Insurance, you don't have to buy it, do you? Unless you have a mortgage,
That's correct.
right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Let me mention one other thing too, Mr. Lawrence. These discounts only apply to owner-occupied structures. The rental properties are not eligible.
In a 1-foot freeboard, we already have that in our law, so we don't have to change anything to still qualify for the 25%, do we?
Well, what I mentioned during the presentation is that because the building code now requires a 1-foot freeboard in it, then we're back to the norm again, even by requiring 1 foot already. So we're going to be losing those points unless we adopt another foot of freeboard.
Well, that's tough for a lot of people, another foot. You know, they might save them 5% money, but that's a lot of expense for a lot of people trying to build now. That's another foot of elevation, more concrete, more whatever, that's added expenses. Then you have to look at is it worth 5% to them, trickling the flood zone? Sometimes it's not. So that's something you have to look at to try to protect the people, to help them the best you can. So maybe another foot's not a good idea right now, I'm not sure. And I don't know what we're gonna lose if we don't do it. I need to find out from you. We're actually gonna lose our 25% because we didn't change anything? Now, they caught up to where we at. So why should we be penalized for that? We already was there. They finally realized that the flood people, you know, they're all about money. So what are you gonna do to the people that's already did all this? So we have to add another foot for the next people coming in? That's like more expense for them.
I think we're in a situation, it sounds like damned if you do, damned if you don't. So if we don't go up, raise the freeboard, we're so close,
That's correct.
we're gonna lose our discount.
That's right. Well,
And if we do go up with it, the people that are, now that we're raising it, it's no fault of theirs, they don't have to build up because they didn't do an addition equal to 50% or better, but they're gonna be below it when they weren't before, and they're gonna lose their discount if they had insurance. Is that correct or
that's correct.
incorrect?
One of the things that we're doing with this proposal to add this foot of freeboard is to make sure that if people are going to be facing increased premiums, that we can still at least make sure that they get 25% off of that increased premium rather than 20% off that increased premium. Because if we lose those 100 points for the 1 foot of freeboard we got, then we're going to drop up to a 6, and we're going to lose that extra 5%. So.
Another question, how else can we gain points without the foot?
There's a manual full of activities that we can take on, and believe me, I'm on these two guys every day to make sure that we're looking for every activity that we can to improve our rating. But there are very few activities in there where you get 100 points for them. You know, most of them you might max out at 25 points, and it takes a lot of effort just to get those 25 points. But this is one thing that we can do where we can get 100 points, and it'll save us from dropping back down into that lower category.
Well, you add an expense to save 5%. That's what you're doing. So that's when we gotta figure what's the worth. Is it worth it? It's not worth it. To people building, not people like you said already here. We're talking about the new people. That's what you have to look at. Can you give us some numbers today? I mean, like somebody building a 3,000 square foot house on the beach, elevating another foot, what does it cost?
Yes.
Somebody got to know that. Somebody in the department or the engineer, and somebody have to have some kind of knowledge of this.
Rick and Kristen at the last training session actually asked for a copy of the PowerPoint that was used, and they wouldn't release it to them. So the information that we've received so far has been very limited.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else? Any other questions?
Yeah, just one question.
Mr. Guines?
I want to combine something that George said, not George, George and Kenny said. The appeal process on the 50%. Is there appeal process if you don't agree with the 50% rule where you
Yes.
have to tear it down?
That's a good question, and let me address that. A lot of times we have people that come in that are getting ready to remodel their house, and so we have to come up with a number for what the house is valued at now, so we use the tax rolls. And you know the tax rolls are traditionally very low. So we'll tell them that, well, you know, we're showing that your house is valued at $100,000, but you're proposing to do $100,000 worth of improvements to it. And they'll say, whoa, wait a minute. My house is worth way more than $100,000. Okay, that's fine. If you'll bring us in an appraisal, we'll use your number. We'll use that number on that official appraisal to evaluate it. And even then, if the numbers are still off, then if they can bring us in a contractor list of everything that's being done plus labor, then we can compare that. So there are options to help them, you know, other than just our determination based on the tax rolls.
So you even use their numbers too?
Yes,
Okay,
we will, yes.
that's all. Thank you.
Okay, there being nothing else, Mr. Lawrence, question?
That rule has always been the same. That hadn't changed. that 50% rule.
50% rule, yes, sir. The substantial
rule has always
improvement
been the
clause has
same.
always been in there, yes, sir.
Okay, Jerry, thank you and your staff, Rick and Kristen. Good job on the questions, Kristen. And the nimble fingers of Eric Nolan, ladies and gentlemen, on the PowerPoint presentation. Nothing else. Is there a motion to adjourn? Mr. Motion by Mr. Lawrence, a second by Mr. Deming. All in favor? We're adjourned. Thank you all.